The steel hull of the Georgia Star collided with the rubber bumpers of the Garden City terminal at exactly 14:12 on October 14, 1992. The impact sent a shudder through the deck plates, a vibration distinct enough to knock a lukewarm cup of coffee off the edge of the navigation table on the bridge. Captain Holloway didn't reach for the cup. He watched the stevedores on the concrete quay below, looking like ants in high-visibility vests, scrambling to secure the heavy hawser lines to the iron bollards. Holloway said. The first mate replied, throwing the telegraph levers. The colossal diesel hum that had vibrated through the ship's bones for 10 days of Atlantic crossing died down, replaced by the mechanical whine of port cranes and the distant, rhythmic clank of container spreaders locking onto steel corners. The ship was a fortress of commerce, 600 feet of floating sovereign territory, now tethered to the Georgia coast. Arthur Sterling stood on the starboard wing of the bridge, watching the gangway being lowered. He was 42 years old, with salt and pepper hair cut to regulation length, and the weathered, leathered skin of a man who had spent 2 decades staring at salt spray. He adjusted the cuffs of his uniform shirt, pulling them down to hide the faint tremor in his hands. The captain called out. Sterling turned, his face composing itself into a mask of professional boredom. Sterling said. He lied with the ease of a man who had been practicing this moment for 6 months. He touched his chest pocket, checking for the thick envelope of cash he had withdrawn from an account in Jacksonville 2 weeks prior, the last of his liquid assets before the creditors froze everything else. Sterling descended the metal stairs, his boots clanging against the diamond plate steps. The ship was entering its dormant phase, the transition from vessel to warehouse. He moved through the corridors, the smell of diesel giving way to the smell of industrial cleaner and stale tobacco. He needed to be careful. In 1992, the Savannah port was a high-security zone, but it was analog security. It relied on eyes, clipboards, and carbon paper. There were no biometric scanners at the gate, no digital surveillance dragging every face into a federal database in real time. There were just fences, floodlights, and men with guns who were tired of working double shifts. He reached the galley. It was empty save for Alvarez, the ship's cook, who was scraping down the griddle with a metal spatula. The air smelled of burnt grease and onions. Alvarez said without looking up. Sterling said. He leaned against the stainless steel counter. This was the second beat of his plan, establishing normalcy. Alvarez laughed, wiping his hands on a stained rag. Sterling grabbed a green apple from the wire basket hanging above the prep table. He tossed it in the air, caught it. Sterling said. The irony tasted like copper in his mouth. He took a bite of the apple. Sterling walked out of the galley, the crunch of the apple loud in the quiet corridor. That was the last verified verbal exchange Arthur Sterling would ever have with a member of the crew. He moved to his cabin on B deck, room 204. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was a monk's cell of utility, a bunk, a desk bolted to the wall, a small locker. He closed the door and locked it. He didn't pack a bag. A bag signaled departure. A bag signaled flight. He stripped off his uniform shirt, folding it precisely and placing it on the back of the chair. He put on a nondescript grey windbreaker, the kind sold in 1,000 department stores across America. He transferred the envelope of cash to the inside pocket of the jacket, pressing it flat against his ribs. He looked around the room. He needed to leave anchors. He took his wallet out of his back pocket and tossed it onto the desk. It landed open, revealing his Merchant Marine ID and a photo of a woman he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Leaving the ID was crucial. A man going AWOL takes his ID. A man going for a quick walk, or a man who has fallen overboard, leaves it behind. He placed a half-pack of Marlboros next to the wallet. He took 1 cigarette out, lit it with his Zippo, took 2 puffs, and then let it burn in the ashtray. The curling grey smoke filled the small room. It was 1845. The sun was setting over the marshlands, turning the Savannah River into a ribbon of dark oil. Sterling opened his door and stepped out. The corridor was empty. Most of the crew were either already ashore or asleep. He moved toward the gangway, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. This was the bottleneck. The gangway was the only way off the ship, and at the bottom of the gangway, sat the watchman's booth. The port of Savannah in October was humid, a sticky, clinging warmth that defied the season. As Sterling stepped out onto the main deck, the floodlights of the terminal were just flickering to life, bathing the concrete wharf in a harsh, sodium-orange glow. He walked down the gangway. The metal ramp flexed under his weight. At the bottom, a small fiberglass booth sat near the security fence. A uniformed guard, a private contractor for the Port Authority, sat on a stool with a clipboard on his lap. He was an older man, heavy-set, with a radio on his belt that crackled with static. Sterling approached the booth. He needed to be memorable enough to be logged, but forgettable enough not to trigger suspicion. Sterling said. The guard looked up, squinting through thick glasses. Sterling said, patting his pockets theatrically. The guard sighed. Strictly speaking, this was a violation. In practice, it happened 10 times a night. The guard looked at the crew manifest attached to his clipboard. He ran a thick finger down the carbon copy list. The list was a mess of smudged ink and handwritten corrections. Quote 25, the guard muttered. He found the line. He uncapped a ballpoint pen. The guard said. Sterling said. The guard wrote something in the logbook. He didn't look up as Sterling walked past the booth, stepping onto the solid concrete of the terminal. Sterling didn't run. He walked with the measured, tired gait of a sailor stretching his legs. He walked toward the stacks of shipping containers that formed a canyon of corrugated steel to his left. He wasn't going to the Seamen's Center. He wasn't going to the phones. He turned the corner around a stack of 40-foot containers, moving into the shadows away from the floodlights. He stopped, pressing his back against the cold metal of a container. He waited. He watched the guard booth for 3 minutes. The guard turned the page of a newspaper. No one picked up the radio. No one shouted. Arthur Sterling had successfully stepped off the Georgia Star. Now he had to vanish from the earth. 4. The alarm didn't sound until 7:30 the next morning. The Georgia Star was a hive of activity. Cranes were swinging overhead, lowering massive steel crates into the cargo hold. The noise was deafening. In the galley, Alvarez was cracking eggs onto the griddle. He looked at the clock. Sterling usually came in for coffee at 7:15 sharp. Alvarez shrugged. Maybe the second officer had found that gumbo and a bottle of bourbon to go with it. On the bridge, Captain Halloway was reviewing the load plan with the chief mate. Halloway asked, not looking up from the blueprints. The chief mate said. Halloway frowned. 10 minutes later, the bosun, a burly man named Davies, keyed the intercom on the bridge. There was a long pause. The static of the intercom filled the bridge. Davies' voice came back, tighter this time. Halloway felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. In maritime law, a missing man was a paperwork nightmare. A missing man with his wallet left behind was a catastrophe. Halloway ordered. For the next hour, the Georgia Star ceased to be a commercial vessel and became a crime scene, though no one called it that yet. The crew moved in teams, sweeping through the labyrinth of steel corridors. They checked the bilges, they checked the chain locker, they checked the space behind the massive rudder hydraulics. Nothing. At 9 o'clock, Captain Halloway made the call he had been dreading. He picked up the radio handset. The response was swift but bureaucratic. 2 patrol cars from the Georgia Ports Authority Police arrived at the gangway within 15 minutes. They were followed by a plainclothes detective named Miller, though in 1992, Miller was just a patrol sergeant looking for a promotion, wearing a uniform that was too tight around the shoulders. Miller walked up the gangway, his boots loud on the metal. He met Halloway on the deck. Miller asked, notebook out. Miller nodded. He walked to the rail and looked down at the water. The gap between the ship and the dock was narrow, maybe 4 feet. Dark, oily water churned sluggishly between the hull and the bumpers. Miller said. Halloway said. Miller said to one of the uniformed officers. The investigation shifted from the ship to the shore. The physical reality of the port became the adversary. The Savannah terminal was surrounded by 12-foot chain-link fences, topped with razor wire. The gates were manned 24/7. To leave, you needed to pass a checkpoint. Miller went down to the gangway watchman's booth. The guard from the night shift was gone, replaced by the day shift. Miller seized the logbook. He flipped back to the previous night. He ran his finger down the entries. Crew coming, crew going, signatures scrawled in haste. He stopped. There was an entry at 1850. A. Starling, deck check. Miller frowned. He looked at the manifest Halloway had given him. He looked closer at the handwriting. It was the guard's handwriting, not a signature. The deck check note was unusual. Usually it would say, shore leave, or customs. Get the night watchman on the phone, Miller barked. I want to know why he wrote deck check, and why he spelled the man's name wrong. While Miller interrogated the paperwork, the dive team arrived. 2 men in black neoprene suits rolled backward off a Zodiac boat into the murky Savannah River. They carried high-powered halogen lights. They spent 3 hours in the water. They searched the hull. They searched the riverbed directly beneath the gangway. They searched the intake valves. The water was opaque, filled with silt and sediment. But a body is a large object. In the confined space of the berth, a body doesn't travel far in 12 hours. Miller stood on the dock, smoking a cigarette, watching the bubbles rise from the divers. The sun was high now, baking the concrete. The smell of tar and salt was overwhelming. The lead diver surfaced, spitting out his regulator. He grabbed the ladder on the quay and pulled himself up, water streaming off his black suit. Miller walked over. The diver shook his head. He pulled his mask down around his neck. Miller looked back at the massive side of the Georgia Star. He looked at the fence line. He looked at the open gate where trucks were lined up, engines idling. If Sterling hadn't fallen in and he wasn't on the ship. Miller walked back to the guard booth. He looked at the logbook again, staring at that single misspelt line. A. Starling. It wasn't an exit signature. It was a notation. He didn't sign out, Miller whispered to himself. The guard wrote him down. Miller keyed his radio. Dispatch, this is Miller. I need a sector search of the terminal yard. All container stacks. We have a missing person who might be hiding in the cargo rows. And get me the contact info for a Jones. He was the contract guard on the night shift. The sun beat down. The port was a maze of 50,000 steel boxes, and Arthur Sterling was nowhere to be found. The ship was clean. The water was empty. Miller closed the logbook with a snap. The only evidence that Arthur Sterling had existed at all after 1845, the previous night, was that one line of blue ink written by a bored man who didn't know how to spell. Miller slid the book into a plastic evidence bag, the Ziploc seal hissing shut like a displeased snake. He tucked it under his arm, the plastic slick against his sweat-dampened shirt. The heat was becoming a physical weight, a heavy, wet blanket of humidity that trapped the diesel fumes and the stench of the low-tide mud against the concrete apron of the dock. He turned his back on the guard booth and faced the sprawl of the terminal. From the elevated position of the quay, the container yard looked less like a center of commerce and more like a necropolis of painted steel. The stacks rose 5, 6 high, red Maersk boxes, blue CMA CGM units, the rust orange of Hapag-Lloyd, creating artificial canyons that stretched for miles inland. The sheer scale of it was nauseating. 50,000 boxes. A man could slip between 2 40-foot containers and rot there for a month before the smell overpowered the chemical tang of the port. A voice called out. Miller looked down the quay. It was Officer Rains, his uniform dark with perspiration, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Rains was young, too young for the port beat, where the corruption was as old and deep as the river silt. He was holding a portable radio that was crackling with static-laced chatter. Rains said, jogging the last few steps, his boots thudding heavily. Miller lit another cigarette, shielding the flame from the river breeze with a cupped hand. He took a long, slow drag, letting the smoke mingle with the heavy air in his lungs before exhaling a grey plume toward the towering bridge of the cargo ship. Miller said, his voice grating like gravel in a mixer. Rains nodded, looking relieved to have a definitive order to relay, even if it was one that would cause a bureaucratic firestorm. He keyed his mic and walked away, his voice pitching up as he relayed the shutdown order. Miller walked toward his sedan, an unmarked Ford that had seen better decades. The air conditioning compressor was dying, and the interior smelled faintly of old fast food and older upholstery, but it was an office. He slid into the driver's seat, leaving the door open to catch the breeze, and picked up the dashboard microphone. "Dispatch, Miller." "Go ahead, Miller." The dispatcher's voice came back, tinny and bored.
"I need a run on a name. Elias Jones, worked contract security, graveyard shift, gate 4. I need a current address, prior record and financial flags. And get me a location on his vehicle. Check the employee lot logs." "Copy that, Miller. Stand by." While he waited, Miller drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. He looked back at the Georgia Star. The ship was a Leviathan, a floating city of steel plates and rivets. Sterling had been a second engineer, a man who knew the bowels of that beast. Why would he come ashore for a deck check? The terminology was wrong. Engineers checked engines, valves, fuel lines. Deck checks were for the mates, the bosuns. Unless deck check was code, or unless Jones, the guard with the poor spelling, was just writing down whatever he was told to write by the man who walked past him, or the man who didn't walk past him. The radio crackled. Miller's eyes narrowed. Gambling debts, a guard who needed money, a crewman who vanished. Smuggling was the heartbeat of the port, usually drugs or exotic animals, sometimes people. If Sterling had stumbled onto something, or was part of something that went wrong, Jones was the gatekeeper who looked the other way. Miller repeated, the cigarette dangling from his lip. Miller grabbed the magnetic light from the passenger seat and slapped it onto the roof of the Ford. He keyed the mic again. He didn't wait for an acknowledgement. He threw the car into reverse, tires crunching on the gravel, and spun the wheel. The Ford lurched forward, engine whining in protest as he accelerated toward the exit gate. The drive out of the terminal was a journey through an industrial wasteland. To his left and right, the container stacks formed a kaleidoscope of commerce, blocking out the sun. The massive gantry cranes stood like prehistoric birds of prey, their cables swaying gently in the wind. The noise of the port usually created a dull roar, a constant background radiation of sound, but as Miller drove, the shutdown order began to take effect. The straddle carriers stopped moving, the trucks idled down. A strange, unnatural silence began to descend over the square miles of concrete, broken only by the cry of seagulls and the hum of Miller's tires. He merged onto the access road, weaving through the line of frustrated truckers who were now stuck in a queue that wasn't moving. The air shimmering off the asphalt was thick with heat distortion. Miller knew the tenements by the cannery. It was a part of Savannah that the tourists never saw, far from the manicured squares and the weeping willows of the historic district. This was the working gut of the city, where the houses leaned precariously and the paint had peeled away during the Carter administration. He turned off the highway, the suspension of the Ford groaning as he hit the potholed surface of River Street. The neighborhood was quiet in the midday heat. Stray dogs slept in the shade of rusted cars. A few residents sat on porches, fanning themselves with newspapers, watching the unmarked police car with eyes that held no affection for the law. Number 404 was a brick structure that looked like it had survived a bombardment. The windows were grime-streaked, some patched with cardboard. The front door was propped open with a cinder block. Miller parked the car, checking his service weapon, a heavy .38 revolver that he preferred over the department-issue Glocks. He stepped out into the stifling air. The smell here was different than the port. It smelled of old grease, stale beer, and hopelessness. He walked up the steps, the wood creaking under his weight. Inside, the hallway was dark and smelled of urine. He found apartment 2B on the second floor. The door was wood, the paint chipped to reveal layers of green, blue, and white underneath. He knocked, hard. "Police, open up!" Silence. He knocked again, pounding the wood with the meat of his fist. "Jones! This is Sergeant Miller. Open the door!" From inside, he heard a scuffling sound. A chair dragging? A window sliding? Miller didn't wait. He took a step back and kicked the door just below the lock. The frame, rotted by years of humidity and neglect, gave way with a splintering crack. The door swung inward, bouncing off the interior wall. Miller entered low, gun drawn, sweeping the room. It was a studio apartment, barely big enough to turn around in. A mattress on the floor, stained and sheetless. A small table cluttered with fast food wrappers and empty beer cans. A TV flickering in the corner, volume muted. The window at the far end was open, the curtain fluttering. Miller holstered his weapon and crossed the room in 2 strides. He leaned out the window. It opened onto a fire escape that led down into an alleyway filled with overflowing dumpsters. He looked down, nothing moving. The alley was empty. He pulled his head back in and scanned the room. Jones had lived like a transient. There were no pictures on the walls, no personal touches, just the debris of existence. Miller moved to the table. Amidst the trash there was a notepad. He used a pen from his pocket to flip the cover open. It was a betting slip. Football scores, point spreads, amounts owed. The numbers were ugly. Jones was in deep. But under the notepad was something else. A receipt. Miller used the pen to slide it out. It was from a gas station on Highway 17, timestamped 6:45 this morning. Jones had bought a full tank of gas, 2 packs of cigarettes, and a prepaid burner phone. Quote 85, Miller muttered. He moved to the mattress. Under the pillow he found the guard's uniform shirt, crumpled into a ball. He shook it out. It smelled of sweat and that same pervasive tar scent from the port. As he shook it, something fell from the breast pocket and clattered onto the linoleum floor. Miller knelt. It was a plastic ID card. Not Jones's. It was a shipboard ID. Georgia Star. The face on the card was young, smiling, with bright eyes that hadn't yet seen enough of the world to be weary. Arthur Sterling, second engineer. Miller stared at the card. Jones had Sterling's ID. That meant Sterling hadn't just gone missing, he had been stripped of his identity. You don't leave the ship without your ID. You don't get back on without it. And Jones had misspelled the name in the logbook because he wasn't looking at the man. He was panicked, writing a cover story after the fact. Or perhaps he was just stupid. But having the ID meant Jones had physical contact with Sterling. Miller pulled out his radio. Dispatch, upgrade the bolo on Elias Jones to a suspect in a kidnapping and possible homicide. He's armed and dangerous. I found the victim's ID in Jones's apartment. And get crime scene down to 404 River Street. I want this place dusted. Copy, Miller. Bolo updated. Miller pocketed the ID card, careful to hold it by the edges. He looked around the shabby apartment one last time. Why leave the ID? Panic. Jones had been in a rush. He grabbed the money, grabbed the car, but missed the card in his pocket when he changed clothes. Miller walked back out to the car. The heat seemed to have intensified. He needed to get back to the port. If Jones had the ID, Sterling never left the terminal. Jones had likely intercepted him or... Miller paused with his hand on the car door. The logbook. Deck check. If Sterling came down the gangway and Jones stopped him, maybe to rob him, maybe to collect on a debt, and things went south, Jones would have a body to hide. He couldn't drive it out. The trucks were searched at the exit gate. He couldn't throw it in the river. Too many eyes, too much chance of it floating back up. He would hide it in the one place where things were designed to disappear, inside a container. Miller's stomach tightened. He looked at the time. 1,300 hours. The sun was baking those steel boxes. If Sterling was alive inside one of them, he was cooking. The internal temperature of a sealed container in this sun could reach 140 degrees within hours. Miller grabbed the mic. Rains, do you copy? Go ahead, Sarge. Rains sounded breathless. Forget the spaces between the stacks. You need to look for broken seals. Look for empty containers that have been resealed. Jones wouldn't have had the keys to a loaded box, but the empties are unlocked or have simple plastic seals. He would have shoved him in an empty and slapped a new seal on it. Sarge, there are 4,000 empties in Sector 7 alone. Then get every man we have. Call in the fire department. Tell them we have a life safety situation involving heat exhaustion in a confined space. Get thermal imaging cameras. If he's in a box, he'll be giving off heat. Use the FLIRs to scan the stacks. Look for a hot spot. On it. Miller slammed the car door and peeled away from the curb, tires screeching. The investigation had just shifted from a missing person case to a race against the sun. The return trip to the port felt like driving into a furnace. Miller ran the siren, forcing the traffic to part. His mind was racing, reconstructing the timeline. 1845, Sterling signs out, or Jones writes him out. 1850, an altercation, Jones knocks him out. 1900, Jones drags him. Where? The guard booth is at the head of the quay. The container stacks start 50 yards away. He would have needed a vehicle. The terminal hustlers, the small utility trucks used to ferry crew and supplies. When Miller roared back through the main gate, the scene had changed. It was no longer a quiet investigation. Fire trucks were rolling in, their red paint clashing with the industrial grime. Men in turnout gear were unloading equipment. Miller skidded to a halt near the Georgia Star's berth and jumped out. Rains ran over, holding a large map of the terminal yard. "We've got 3 teams with thermal cameras," Rains said, pointing to the grid. "They're scanning the first tier of empties here, here, and here. Nothing yet." "What about the utility trucks?" Miller asked, scanning the quay. "The little white pickups the guards use." "They're parked over by the maintenance shed." "Did anyone check them?" Rains blinked. "No, sir. We were focused on the water and the boxes." Miller started running toward the maintenance shed, a low, corrugated iron building about 200 yards down the dock. "Check the beds. If he moved a body, there will be trace." He reached the row of 3 beat-up Ford Rangers. He went to the first one. Clean bed, just some loose gravel. The second one, filled with coils of rope. The third one, Miller peered over the side. The bedliner was black plastic, ribbed and scarred from years of abuse. But in the corner, near the tailgate, there was a smear. It was dark, tacky in the heat. Blood. And next to it, a single shiny brass button. A button from a dress uniform, or a merchant marine officer's jacket. Miller didn't touch it. He leaned in, sniffing. Copper and iron. Fresh. "Quote 103, he bellowed. "Quote 104. Rains was already on the radio. A technician from the Port Authority, a nervous man in a hard hat, hurried over with a laptop. He plugged a cable into the diagnostic port under the dashboard of the Ranger. The tech stammered. Miller paced while the tech typed. The sun was merciless. He wiped sweat from his eyes. Every minute Sterling sat in a box was a minute closer to death. "Quote 108, the tech said. "Quote 109. "Quote 1010, Miller repeated. That was deep in the yard. The quote 111 section, where old containers waited to be sold for scrap or refurbished. "Quote 112, the tech said. 114, Miller said. He didn't wait for the car. He jumped onto the running board of a passing fire truck. "Row 44, go!" The fire truck surged forward, its diesel engine roaring. Miller held onto the grab bar, the wind hot in his face. They wove through the canyons of steel, passing row after row of containers. 20, 30, 40. "Turn here!" Miller shouted, banging on the cab door. The truck swung wide into row 44. This section was desolate. The asphalt was cracked, weeds growing through the fissures. The containers here were faded, their logos bleached by the sun. "Stop!" Miller jumped off before the truck had fully halted. He ran to Stack C. It was a block of 20 containers, stacked too high. "Thermal!" Miller yelled. A firefighter ran up with a handheld FLIR camera. He aimed it at the containers on the ground level. "Scanning!" the firefighter muttered. "Ground temp is 110. Container surface is 135. Wait!" He moved the camera to the third container from the left, a rusted brown box with no markings. "I've got a differential," the firefighter said, his voice tightening. "This one is showing 142, and there's a localized hotspot near the door seam, like heat venting out." "Cut it," Miller ordered. "Cut it open." 2 firefighters rushed forward with a hydraulic spreader, the jaws of life. They jammed the tips of the tool into the gap between the heavy steel doors. The hydraulic pump whined, the metal groaned, a sound like a dying animal. The lock bar bent, the steel screaming as it was forced past its yield point. With a loud bang, the seal snapped and the doors popped open a few inches. A blast of superheated air hit them. It smelled of stale air, rust, and sickness. Miller grabbed the door handle and hauled it open. The interior was pitch black. Light! A halogen beam cut into the darkness. At the far end of the 40-foot tunnel of steel, a figure lay crumpled against the wall. He was stripped to his undershirt, his skin angry red, shiny with sweat that had long since stopped flowing. "Medic!" Miller screamed, sprinting into the oven-like heat of the container. He reached the man, Arthur Sterling. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and rapid, a desperate rasping sound. His skin was burning to the touch. Miller grabbed him by the shoulders. "I've got you, son. I've got you." The firefighters were there in seconds, lifting Sterling onto a backboard. They rushed him out into the sunlight, stripping his clothes, packing his armpits and groin with ice packs from the trauma kit. "Core temp is sky high," a paramedic shouted. "We need to cool him down now. IV fluids, wide open." Miller backed away, letting them work. He leaned against the side of the container, his legs suddenly feeling like rubber. He took a breath, the air tasting sweet despite the fumes. He looked at the floor of the container where Sterling had been lying, scratched into the rust of the floor, marks from fingernails, and words written in dust and sweat. Jones. Codes. Miller stared at the words. Codes. Sterling hadn't just been robbed, he had been interrogated. Raines said, coming up beside him. Miller said, watching the ambulance crew load Sterling onto the stretcher. Willer said. He straightened up, the exhaustion replaced by a cold, hard anger. Miller walked over to the ambulance as the doors were closing. He looked at the paramedic. The ambulance sped off, sirens wailing, cutting through the silence of the port. Miller turned back to Raines. He looked up at the Georgia Star, looming in the distance. The ship was silent now. The loading halted. Miller added, lighting a fresh cigarette. Miller walked toward the fire truck to catch a ride back to his car. He looked toward the city skyline, shimmering in the heat. The sun beat down, indifferent and cruel, but the maze of 50,000 steel boxes had given up its secret. Now the hunt was on. Detective Miller kicked open the double doors of St. Joseph's emergency ward, the rubber soles of his shoes squeaking violently against the polished linoleum. He didn't wait for the triage nurse to acknowledge him. He walked straight to Bay 4, the curtain still fluttering from the draft of the air conditioning. The bed was empty. The sheets were stripped, piled in a blue plastic hamper in the corner. The heart monitor was dark, its leads coiled neatly over the stand. Miller demanded, spinning around to face a young nurse who was adjusting a tray of saline bags. Miller barked, flashing his badge but not slowing down. The nurse blinked, startled by the intensity in Miller's voice. She looked at the clipboard in her hands, flipping up the top page. Sterling, bed 4. He was processed for transfer. Transfer? Miller stepped closer, invading her personal space. I ordered him held under guard. I explicitly told the paramedic. The order came from specialist care, the nurse said, her voice trembling slightly as she pointed to a signature on the carbon copy form. Burn unit capacity was reached here. They routed him to Memorial immediately. Transport left 5 minutes ago. Miller snatched the clipboard. He stared at the signature at the bottom. It was a scribble, illegible, barely ink on the page. He looked at the transport authorization code. Auth, 88-Delta. That's a coroner's code, Miller whispered. The cold, hard anger he had felt at the port solidified into ice in his gut. He dropped the clipboard on the desk and sprinted for the exit, his radio already in his hand. Dispatch, this is Miller. Put a perimeter on the exits of St. Joseph's. I want every ambulance stopped. Now. But as he burst out into the humid savannah night, the ambulance bay was empty. The sirens in the distance were fading, blending into the city's chaotic hum. There was no specific vehicle to chase. There were a dozen routes out of the city, and Arthur Sterling, the man who had just clawed his way back from the dead, had vanished into the administrative ether. The classification of Arthur Sterling as a missing person did not happen with a bang, but with the slow, grinding friction of rubber stamps on paper. Miller sat at his desk,
surrounded by 3 distinct towers of files. The air in the precinct was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee. Across from him, Rains was typing up the incident report from the hospital, the keys of his typewriter clacking like gunfire.
"Hospital says the transfer paperwork was forged," Rains said, not looking up. "The ambulance that picked him up wasn't in the rotation. It was a decommissioned unit sold at auction 3 months ago. Paint job was still official, though." "So he didn't walk out," Miller said, rubbing his temples. "He was extracted." "Or he hired them," Rains suggested. "The paramedics said he was conscious. Maybe Sterling made a call before they loaded him up." Miller picked up the intake form from the Port Authority, the one Sterling had signed 3 years ago when he took the job as a loader. A man with $40,000 in debt and a burn radius covering 30% of his body doesn't hire a private extraction team, Rains. Someone took him. Jones's people. "Jones is sitting in holding and he hasn't said a word," Rains countered. "We have the fingernail marks, the codes writing, but without Sterling, it's assault, maybe attempted murder. If Sterling is dead, it's murder, but we don't have a body." Miller looked at the whiteboard. "Arthur Sterling, missing." "We need to go back to the water," Miller said. "Sarge, we swept the river. The dive team is exhausted." "Not for a body," Miller said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. "For the paper. If he's gone, he's gone. But he didn't fly. If he left Savannah, he went by road or by sea, and the road is too risky for a man in his condition. Check the port logs again." "The logs are a mess, Sarge. Half of them are handwritten by guys who failed English. Then we read them until they make sense." The room smelled of mildew and wet cardboard. It was a basement tomb where the daily lives of sailors and longshoremen were buried in triplicate. Miller had spent the last 6 months coming here twice a week. The investigation had officially stalled, downgraded to a cold case status faster than he had ever seen. The department wanted to move on. The city wanted the port to keep making money, not answering questions about security breaches. He was looking for a pattern. The ghost ship theory. It was a term the old salts used for unregistered vessels, or vessels that swapped identities mid-ocean. Miller theorized that Sterling hadn't been killed. He had been smuggled out. The codes Sterling had written referred to the electronic seals on high-value containers. If Sterling knew how to bypass them, he was a valuable asset to a smuggling ring. He wasn't a victim, he was a recruit. Miller pulled a binder labeled Exit Manifests, Q3-1993. He ran his finger down the columns. Vessel name, captain, destination, crew count. The manual nature of the records was infuriating. A handwritten entry for the Georgia Star listed 22 crew members upon arrival, but the departure log, scribbled in blue ballpoint, looked like a 23, or maybe a smudge. He flipped the page. October 12, 1993. Vessel, the Iron Maiden. Flag, Panama. Crew, 14. He cross-referenced this with the harbourmaster's visual check. The harbourmaster had noted 15 souls on board in his personal logbook, a discrepancy Miller had found 3 weeks ago. 1 extra person. Miller pulled a photocopy of Sterling's medical file from 1990, the physical he took to get his merchant marine license. Distinguishing marks, tattoo, left forearm. Nautical star with a cracked compass. Miller closed his eyes. He had circulated that description to every port authority on the eastern seaboard. Interpol had it. Nothing. "Detective?" Miller looked up. It was the archivist, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who looked as dusty as the files she guarded. "Phone for you. It's the coroner." Miller felt a jolt of adrenaline. He walked to the wall-mounted phone in the hallway. "Miller?" "We found one," the coroner said. His voice was tinny. "Fishermen pulled a floater out of the marsh near Tybee Island. Decomp is advanced, but the height matches Sterling." "Burn marks?" Miller asked. "Hard to tell. The crabs got to the skin, but there's a watch, cheap Timex, matches the description of what Sterling was wearing." Miller hung up. He walked back into the archive room. He looked at the stack of manifests, the endless lists of ships that had sailed into the dark. If the body was Sterling, the ghost ship theory was dead. The extraction theory was dead. It meant Jones or his crew had just dumped him in the river like trash. But when Miller arrived at the morgue 2 hours later, the hope died a different death. The body on the slab was the right height. The watch was a Timex. But as the coroner cleaned the remaining flesh on the left arm, the skin was smooth. No tattoo. No scar tissue from where a tattoo had been removed. "It's not him," Miller said, the disappointment tasting like ash in his mouth. "Dental records will confirm," the coroner said. "I don't need dental," Miller said, turning away. "Sterling had a star on his arm. This guy has nothing." Miller walked out into the parking lot. It was 1994. Sterling had been gone for a year. The port was moving millions of tons of cargo, and somewhere in that flow of steel and commerce, Arthur Sterling was still a ghost. The transition from the analog world to the digital was not a revolution. It was a tedious, agonizing migration. Sarah Jenkins sat in a cubicle that was too small for her ambition. She was 28, an auditor for Maritime General Insurance, contracted by the Port Authority to oversee the digitization of their archives. The Department of Homeland Security required all port records dating back 20 years to be searchable in the new federal database. For Sarah, this meant spending 8 hours a day watching a high-speed scanner digest rotting paper. Her job wasn't just to scan, it was to verify. The optical character recognition, OCR, software was glitchy. It frequently mistook a handwritten quote 182 for a quote 183, or a quote 184 for a quote 185. Sarah had to manually correct the errors. She rubbed her eyes, the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a frequency that seemed to drill into her skull. On her screen was a manifest from 1992. Vessel, the Lady Jane. Crew list. The software had flagged an entry. Name, Arthur Starling. Sarah sighed. Typo. The clerk in 1992 had misspelled it. She clicked the field to correct it. She typed Arthur Sterling. As soon as she hit enter, a dialog box popped up on her screen. A red banner. Sarah paused. She took a sip of her lukewarm water. She knew the name. Everyone in the industry knew the name. The quote, 186. The ghost story. She looked at the document on her screen again. This was a crew manifest from 1992, a year before he disappeared. It was a routine exit log. Nothing suspicious. He was working on the Lady Jane. But her auditor's brain, trained to spot fraud in the jagged lines of actuarial tables, noticed something else. She opened a second window and pulled up the digitized file for the Lady Jane's 1992 voyage. She scrolled down to the payroll records, which had been scanned the previous week. Arthur Sterling was paid for the voyage, but there was a discrepancy in the direct deposit routing number compared to the other crew members. Most of the crew used local banks, First Union, Wachovia. Sterling's routing number was for a credit union in Mobile, Alabama. Sarah frowned. She checked Sterling's personnel file, the one Miller had built in the 90s. It listed his residence as Savannah. No mention of Alabama connections. She typed the routing number into the interbank verification tool, a new piece of software that was sluggish and prone to crashing. The wheel spun for 30 seconds. Result. Account closed, 1995. Sarah leaned back. If Sterling died or vanished in 1993, why was his account in Alabama active until 1995? She looked at the clock. 5:15 p.m. The office was emptying out. She should go home. She had a yoga class at 6. But the anomaly was like a loose thread on a sweater. She couldn't leave it. She opened the search parameters for the entire digitization database. She typed in the specific routing number, not the name. Names could be faked. Social security numbers could be stolen. But bank routing numbers combined with specific account strings were harder to fudge in the pre-digital age without raising flags. The search bar pulsed. Scanning 45,000 records. Sarah waited. She picked up a stress ball from her desk and squeezed it rhythmically. Match found. Sarah sat up straight. It wasn't a payroll record. It was a medical claim. Wait, that's next year? No, the date stamp on the file is... She squinted. The document date was processed yesterday by the Central Clearinghouse, but the incident date was listed as August 4th, 2006. It was a claim filed 3 weeks ago. Why did the system flag it? Sarah clicked the quote _1872 tab. The system had linked it because of a scanned attachment in the claim file, a photocopy of an old, water-damaged medical history form provided by the claimant to prove he had no prior history of nerve damage. The handwriting on the 2006 form matches the handwriting on the 1992 manifest. Sarah felt a chill go down her spine. It wasn't just the handwriting. The claim was for a workplace injury, a chemical burn. The claimant was arguing that the burn obscured a pre-existing tattoo, and therefore the company couldn't use the tattoo for identification purposes in the settlement. Sarah printed the screen. The printer whirred to life, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet office. She grabbed the paper. She needed to find Detective Miller. He was retired now, pushed out 2 years ago, but she knew he still drank at the bar near the docks. She looked at the image on the paper. It was a scanned photo of the injury, submitted for the insurance claim. A raw, red burn on a forearm. But at the very edge of the burn, just where the healthy skin began, there was a faint line of blue ink, the tip of a nautical star. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the precinct's old number, the one she had on a sticky note, for quote 188 quote. A tired voice answered. She said, her voice steady. Sarah said, looking at the fresh ink on the page. The routine migration of records had done what 13 years of manhunts couldn't. It had found the money, and where there was money, there was a man. Sarah initiated the transfer of the file to the active server. The screen flashed. Upload complete. The digital trap had snapped shut. Now came the hardest part, acting as if nothing had happened. Sarah stared at the blinking cursor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The upload bar had vanished, replaced by the standard server directory, innocent and mundane. But in the invisible architecture of the network, tripwires were humming. If Sterling was alive, if he had the resources everyone suspected he had, the active server wasn't just a repository, it was a listening post. She forced her hand to release the mouse. Her fingers were stiff, the knuckles white. The office was too quiet. The usual ambient hum of the HVAC system seemed to have dropped an octave, deepening into a menacing drone. She reached for the printed page, the paper still warm from the fuser. This single sheet was dangerous. It was tangible proof of a ghost story. She folded it once, sharp and precise, then again, and slid it into the inner pocket of her blazer, right against the silk lining. She didn't trust her bag. Purses could be snatched, briefcases could be left in cabs, but she would feel the crinkle of that paper against her ribs with every breath. Sarah stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the plastic floor mat. She winced, freezing for a second, waiting for a head to pop up over the cubicle partitions. "Stop it," she told herself. "You're an auditor. You work late. This is normal." But nothing about Arthur Sterling was normal. The man wasn't just a thief. He was a void where money and people used to be. The 1992 manifest she had cross-referenced wasn't just a shipping list. It was the last known record of the Lady Vengeance, a cargo hauler that had departed with 12 crew members and $40 million in bearer bonds, only to be found drifting 3 weeks later with empty holds and scrubbed decks. No bodies, just bleach and silence. She began the ritual of shutting down. She couldn't just run. Panic was a signal. She tidied her desk, aligning her pens, stacking the unrelated files on the corner. She logged out of her terminal, watching the screen fade to black, catching the reflection of her own pale, terrified face in the monitor before it died. The walk to the elevator felt like crossing a minefield. The motion sensor lights flickered on ahead of her, creating a tunnel of illumination that made the surrounding darkness of the open-plan office feel thicker, heavier. Every shadow cast by a filing cabinet looked like a crouching figure. She pressed the call button. The wait was excruciating. Ding! The doors slid open. Empty. Sarah stepped in and punched the button for the garage, exhaling a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. As the car descended, she leaned her head back against the metal wall, closing her eyes. The image of the burn kept flashing behind her eyelids. A chemical burn. Hydrofluoric acid, maybe?
Or something industrial, something used in the stripping of hulls. It was a painful way to hide an identity. It spoke of desperation, or perhaps a calculated brutality toward one's own flesh that matched Sterling's psychological profile perfectly. He was a man who would cut off his own hand to slip a handcuff. Burning a tattoo was practically a manicure for him. The elevator jolted to a halt at the sub-basement. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of exhaust and damp concrete. Her footsteps echoed with a wet slap against the sealed floor. She reached her Honda, her keys fumbling in her hand. She unlocked the door manually, a habit born of paranoia that had started 3 years ago when she first took the senior analyst position. The electronic fobs were hackable. A physical key was a commitment. Once inside, she locked the doors instantly. She checked the back seat in the rearview mirror. Empty. She checked the footwells. Clear. Starting the engine, she didn't turn on the radio. She needed to think. She needed Miller. Driving out of the garage and into the city rain, Sarah merged into the sparse, late-night traffic. The wipers slapped a rhythmic beat. Swish-clack, swish-clack. It was a hypnotic counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Detective Jack Miller, the man who had obsessed over the Lady Vengeance case until it cost him his badge, his pension, and his marriage. He had been the one to tell her, years ago during a preliminary audit interview, that Sterling wasn't dead. Quote 197, he had said, spinning a cheap lighter on the interrogation table. Quote 198. He had been laughed out of the precinct 2 years later. Quote 199, the departmental shrink had called it. Sarah knew better. She knew he had found something the brass didn't want found, or perhaps he had simply annoyed the wrong people by refusing to let the dead stay dead. She turned off the highway, heading toward the industrial district. The gentrified skyscrapers gave way to low, brick warehouses and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. The streetlights here were yellow sodium vapor, casting a sickly, jaundiced glow over the wet pavement. She found the bar, the Rusty Anchor, tucked between a dry dock and a bail bondsman's office. It was a dive in the truest sense of the word, a place where people went not to socialize, but to disappear for a few hours. The neon sign out front buzzed with an erratic flicker. The R and Y burnt out, leaving it to read, Ust Anchor. Sarah parked in the shadows across the street. She checked the folded paper in her jacket one last time, verifying it was real, that she hadn't hallucinated the nautical star. The ink was still sharp. She ran through the rain, dodging puddles that shimmered with oil slicks. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of the bar, and the smell hit her instantly. A wall of stale beer, cigarette smoke, despite the ban, and the briny, rot scent of the nearby harbour. The place was dim. A jukebox in the corner was playing a low, mournful country song about trains and prisons. There were only 4 people in the bar. The bartender, a massive man cleaning a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the glass, a couple huddled in a booth whispering aggressively, and a solitary figure at the far end of the bar, hunched over a tumbler of amber liquid. Sarah walked over. The floorboards creaked under her heels. The man at the bar didn't turn. He wore a canvas jacket that had seen better decades, and his grey hair was overgrown, curling over the collar. "Hello, Jack," Sarah said softly, taking the stool next to him. Miller's hand paused on its way to his mouth. He didn't look at her. He just stared into the amber depth of his whiskey, as if reading the future in the grain. Quote 203, he rasped. His voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. He took a drink, a long, shuddering swallow. She said. The silence that followed was heavy. The jukebox song ended, and the mechanism whirred, searching for the next disc. For a moment, the only sound was the clink of Miller's glass hitting the wood. Miller slowly turned his head. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red, and surrounded by a map of deep wrinkles. But the gaze itself was sharp. The dull glaze of alcohol vanished,
replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He warned. Sarah said. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the folded paper. She smoothed it out on the sticky bar top, pushing it toward him. Miller looked at it with disdain. She commanded, tapping the paper. Miller sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He put them on, transforming instantly from a barfly to the detective he used to be. He leaned in, the bar light reflecting off his lenses. He scanned the text. His lips moved slightly as he read the data fields. Then his eyes drifted to the photo of the burn. 255, he muttered. 216. 217, Sarah whispered. 218. Miller squinted. He tilted the paper to catch the light. He froze. Sarah saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He stayed frozen for a long time, 10 seconds, 20. Then, very slowly, he traced the air above the photo with a trembling finger. He breathed. Sarah said, "He love," she pointed to the signature block at the bottom. John Doe. Miller looked at the signature. He looked at the looping tail of the J, the sharp, aggressive cross of the T in the witness line. He closed his eyes and took the glasses off, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He said softly. Miller opened his eyes. They weren't tired anymore. They were terrified. "Mobile," he said, reading the location again. "Mobile shipyards. That's deep cover. That's hard labor. Sterling was a white-collar predator. He wouldn't be welding hulls. He would if he needed to wait out the statute of limitations on the federal charges," Sarah countered, "or if he needed access to the shipyard's manifest system. Think about it. Mobile is a hub for South American freight. If he's moving product again—" "He's not moving product," Miller cut in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If he's in a shipyard, he's building something, or modifying something." Miller downed the rest of his drink in one gulp and slammed the glass down. "You uploaded this?" "To the active server, just now." Miller swore loudly. The bartender looked over, bored. "You rang the dinner bell, Sarah," Miller hissed. "If he has a tap on the insurance database, and he does, because that's how he creates his aliases, then he knows." "He knows the system flagged it," Sarah argued. "He doesn't know I flagged it. It looks like an algorithmic hit." "With Sterling, there are no coincidences. He'll check the access logs. He'll see your user ID." Miller slid off the stool, swaying slightly before finding his balance. He grabbed his coat. "We have to go." "Go where? To the police?" Miller laughed, a dry, barking sound. "The police? The mobile PD will take 3 days to process a request. By then, this John Doe will be in the wind, and you'll have a tragic car accident on your way to work. No, we have to go to mobile." "Now?" "Right now. My truck's out back." "I have my car." "Leave it," Miller said. "It's got GPS, right? OnStar? Leave it. We take my truck. It's a 98. Dumb as a rock. No tracking." Sarah hesitated. This was crossing a line. This was leaving the audit trail and entering the field. But she looked at Miller, saw the energy returning to him, the spark of purpose that had been extinguished for years. And she thought of the man who had burned his own arm to hide a star. "Okay," she said. They exited through the back door into the alley. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the grime of the city into a slick, black paste. Miller's truck was a battered Ford F-150, rusted around the wheel wells, looking more like a piece of industrial debris than a vehicle. As they climbed in, the smell of old coffee and stale tobacco enveloped her. Miller cranked the engine. It roared to life with a cough and a sputter. "Mobile is a 4-hour drive if I speed," Miller said, grinding the gears into reverse. "I need you to tell me everything about that file. Every code, every timestamp. What else was in the attachment?" "Just the medical history," Sarah said, buckling her seatbelt as Miller peeled out of the alley. "But there was a secondary insurer listed. A shell company based in the Caymans. Poseidon Risk Management." Miller hit the steering wheel. Poseidon. That's the leak. That's how he's washing the money. He's insuring his own workers, paying out claims to himself to clean the cash. That's why he filed the claim, Sarah realized. It wasn't about the injury, it was a test transaction. He was testing the pipeline. And you just blocked the pipe, Miller said, merging onto the interstate heading south. The city lights began to fade behind them, replaced by the crushing darkness of the highway. So, Miller said, his eyes scanning the mirrors, tell me about the alias. Arthur Sterling is dead. John Doe is a placeholder. What name is he actually using on the floor? The file didn't say. It just said, alias pending review. But, Sarah hesitated. But what? There was a shift supervisor listed on the incident report. A witness. Name was K. Vance. Miller went rigid. The truck swerved slightly before he corrected it. Kevin Vance, Miller whispered. You know him? Vance was the quartermaster on the Lady Vengeance, Miller said, his voice hollow. He was supposed to be dead. He was supposed to have gone down with the others. So he didn't kill the crew, Sarah said, a cold realization dawning on her. He turned them. Not all of them, Miller corrected grimly. Just the ones useful enough to keep around. Vance could cook books and navigate. If Vance is there, the whole inner circle might be there. We're not walking into a one-man hideout, Sarah. We're walking into a colony. The rain lashed against the windshield, blurring the world outside. Sarah felt the magnitude of what she had done. She hadn't just found a fraudster. She had stumbled upon a ghost ship that had made landfall. Sarah asked. Miller said. Our drive was a blur of black asphalt and passing headlights. Miller drove with a terrifying intensity, pushing the old truck to its limits. For hours, they spoke in bursts, piecing together the timeline. 2006, the burn. 2010, Sterling's declared death in absentia. 2015, the migration of the legacy servers. It all fit. The system was never meant to catch him. It was only by the sheer accident of a software update merging two disparate databases that the handwriting samples had ever occupied the same digital space. By the time they hit the outskirts of Mobile, the rain had stopped, replaced by a thick, soupy fog rolling off the Gulf. The air was heavier here, smelling of salt and swamp. Miller navigated the truck off the highway and into a labyrinth of back roads. The scenery shifted from strip malls to dense vegetation and rusted metal structures. They were entering the scrapyards. Miller said, pulling behind a wall of stacked, crushed cars. They got out. The humidity was oppressive. Sarah's blouse stuck to her back. The silence of the scrapyard was different from the office. It was alive with the sound of insects and dripping water. Miller led her through a maze of twisted metal. It was a graveyard of machines, cranes, cars, boat hulls, all rotting in the humid air. Finally, they reached a clearing where a small corrugated shack stood, elevated on cinder blocks. A light burned in the window. Miller stopped. He picked up a piece of scrap metal and banged a specific rhythm on the leg of a crane tower. Clang, clang, clang. A moment later, the door of the shack opened. A silhouette appeared, holding a shotgun. A voice croaked. Gator lowered the gun and beckoned them up. Inside, the shack was surprisingly tidy, filled with monitors showing camera feeds from around the salvage yard. Gator was a wiry man with skin like leather and eyes that darted constantly. Gator asked, looking Sarah up and down. Miller said. Gator froze. He looked at Miller, then at Sarah. Sarah said, her voice steady. Gator sat down heavily on a milk crate. He rubbed his face. Miller asked. Gator looked up, fear in his eyes. Miller said. Gator chewed his lip. Miller said. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline. This was madness. She was an auditor. She dealt in spreadsheets, not storm drains. But the image of the burn, that deliberate, self-inflicted mutilation, drove her forward. Gator said to Sarah. Sarah handed it over. Gator scanned it, his fingers dancing over a keyboard on his desk. He was cross-referencing. Gator muttered. Sarah asked. Gator said. Miller said. Gator said, pointing to the screen. He had pulled up a schematic of the shipyard's power grid. Look at the power draw for Dry Dock 4. It's spiking. Massive surges every 6 hours.
Welding? Sarah asked.
No, Gator said darkly. That looks like charging cycles, high-capacity batteries, or what?
Or a railgun test, Miller finished. The silence in the shack was deafening. Sterling isn't running drugs, Miller said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He's not stealing bonds anymore. He's going privateer. He's building a warship to sell to the highest bidder. Cartels, warlords, whoever pays. We have to stop him, Sarah said.
It wasn't a question anymore.
Miller said. Gator stood up and went to a locker. He pulled out 2 dark jumpsuits and a waterproof bag. Sarah took the jumpsuit. The fabric was rough. It felt real. The digital trap she had set in the office felt like a lifetime ago. Gator said, stopping them at the door. Miller checked his service pistol, a relic he had kept illegally. He racked the slide. The bayou was black ink. The skiff cut through the water silently, the electric motor humming barely above the sound of the crickets. Gator steered with practiced ease, navigating around cypress knees and submerged logs. Sarah sat in the bow, clutching the waterproof bag containing a camera Gator had lent them. The fog was thicker on the water, wrapping them in a cold embrace. Gator whispered, killing the engine. Ahead,
looming out of the mist like a mountain of steel, were the mobile shipyards. Floodlights cut through the fog, illuminating the massive cranes that stood like sentinels. But to the far left, shrouded in shadow, was Dry Dock 4. It was a massive concrete hangar, its doors rusted shut. Gator said softly. Miller said. They slipped into the water. It was cold and tasted of oil. Sarah gasped, but Miller clamped a hand over her shoulder, steadying her. They waded toward the dark opening of the concrete pipe, half submerged in the muck. Inside the pipe, the smell was atrocious, ammonia and rot. They crawled on hands and knees, the water sloshing around their shins. Rats skittered along the ledges above them, their eyes reflecting the weak beam of Miller's tactical light. It took 20 minutes to reach the end. The pipe opened up into a grate that looked down into the dry dock. Miller pushed gently on the grate. It was loose. He slid it aside, and they pulled themselves up onto a catwalk. They were high up in the rafters of the hangar. Below them, the space was cavernous, and it wasn't empty. Sparks showered down in cascades of orange fire. The sound of grinders and welders filled the air, a cacophony of industry. Sarah looked down, and her breath caught in her throat. Sitting in the cradle of the dry dock was a vessel. It was sleek, painted a matte, light-absorbing black. It didn't look like a cargo ship. It looked like a shark. Angular, aggressive, with a low profile. And on the bow, beneath the scaffolding, a team of men were installing something that looked terrifyingly like a cannon barrel, but encased in electromagnetic coils. Miller whispered. Sarah raised the camera. She needed the shot. She zoomed in. Down on the floor, directing the work, was a man in a white hard hat. He wasn't wearing a jumpsuit like the others. He wore a tailored suit, oddly out of place among the sparks. He was holding a tablet, pointing at the weapon assembly. Sarah adjusted the focus. The man turned his head slightly. It was an older face, lined by time, but the eyes were unmistakable, cold, calculating. Sterling, she mouthed. Then, the man in the suit stopped. He didn't look at the ship. He looked down at his tablet. He frowned. He tapped the screen, then looked up. Not at the workers. He looked straight up into the rafters, specifically at the catwalk where they were crouching. Miller grabbed Sarah's arm. Below them, the work stopped. Sterling pointed up. A siren began to wail, not a standard alarm, but a sharp, oscillating tactical alert. Miller shouted. They scrambled back toward the grate, but the door behind them, the one leading to the roof access, burst open. 3 men in black tactical gear poured out, rifles raised. Miller shoved Sarah flat against the metal grating as bullets sparked against the railing where her head had been a second ago. Miller returned fire, 2 booming shots from his revolver that echoed like thunder in the enclosed space. One of the attackers stumbled back. Miller yelled. Sarah screamed, pointing. More men were swarming the lower levels, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped on the catwalk, 80 feet above the concrete floor, with a paramilitary death squad closing in from both ends. Sarah looked over the railing. Below them, directly beneath the catwalk, was the open hatch of the black ship. She yelled, grabbing his shoulder. Miller looked down, then at the gunman advancing on them. He did the math instantly. They vaulted over the railing. For a second there was only wind and gravity. Then they slammed onto the deck of the black vessel, rolling to absorb the impact. Sarah bruised her ribs, gasping for air, but adrenaline masked the pain. Miller commanded, dragging her toward the open hatch. They tumbled into the dark interior of the ship, just as bullets pinged off the armored hull around them. Miller spun and slammed the heavy steel hatch shut, spinning the locking wheel. Darkness swallowed them. Miller panted, leaning against the bulkhead. Sarah wheezed. Miller clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom. They were in a corridor. It was pristine, high-tech, looking more like a spaceship than a boat. Sarah said, her auditor brain taking over. Miller said. Sarah said. Sarah said. Miller grinned in the dark. They moved deeper into the ship. The sounds of boots clanging on the hull outside were getting louder. Sterling's men were coming. They found the engineering bay near the stern. It was a massive room filled with banks of humming server racks and thick power conduits glowing with blue indicator lights. There, Sarah pointed to a central console. That controls the load distribution. She ran to the terminal. It was locked, asking for a biometric scan. Damn it, she hissed. It needs a handprint. Miller looked at the heavy steel door they had just come through. Someone was cutting it with a torch. Sparks were flying. We have about 2 minutes, Miller said. Can you bypass it? I'm an auditor, not a hacker. Auditing is just hacking with permission. Think, Sarah. How does the system identify the user? Sarah looked at the screen. Access restricted. Project Poseidon. Poseidon, she muttered. She remembered the insurance file. Poseidon Risk Management. The claim, she said aloud. The claim file I uploaded. It had his medical data. It had the scan of the burn. So the system links everything. If he's using the same network for his insurance fraud as he is for his ship, maybe the credentials are shared. She pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. I need a connection. She frantically looked around. She saw a USB port on the console. I have the file on my drive. I saved a backup before I left. She fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a small thumb drive attached to her keychain. She jammed it into the console. The screen flickered. External drive detected. Scanning. File found. Claim 8944, sterling.pdf. Come on, she whispered. She accessed the command line. She wasn't a coder, but she knew SQL. She knew how databases talk to each other. She typed furiously. Override command. User ID 8944. Authentication. Biometric bypass via medical override. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary. She was betting that Sterling's ego was his weakness, that he had tied his alias so tightly to his real identity that the system would recognize the authority of the quote 377 in the claim. The door behind them groaned. The torch had cut through the latch. Quote 378. Miller warned, raising his gun. Enter. The screen flashed red. Error. Biometric match. She cried. The 37, she cried. The door behind them, the designs were true. The door behind them, which was enter. The kicked open. 3 men stormed in. Miller fired, taking one down, but he was forced to dive behind a server rack as automatic fire shredded the air. Sarah stared at the screen. Biometric mismatch. Suddenly, she remembered the burn. The nautical star. The disconnect in the handwriting. She realized. Miller yelled over the gunfire. She shouted. She scrutinized the file data in her mind. Who approved the claim? Who was the supervisor? K. Vance. She screamed. She typed rapidly. User override K. Vance. Authorization code Manifest 1992. It was a guess based on the fact that these men were obsessed with their own history. The screen turned green. Access granted. Miller roared, changing power distribution interface to maximum. Battery bank 1, overload. Battery bank 2, overload. A deep, thrumming vibration shook the deck plates. The blue lights on the conduits turned angry red. A high-pitched whine began to build, rising in pitch until it hurt their ears. A synthesized voice announced. The men at the door hesitated. They knew what that sound meant. Miller grabbed Sarah. He pointed to a maintenance hatch in the floor. He kicked it open. They dropped down into the bilge just as the first battery bank exploded in the room above them. The force of the blast knocked them into the dirty water of the bilge, but the thick decking shielded them from the fire. Miller yelled. They crawled through the bilge, water rising as the hull integrity failed. The ship was groaning, dying. They found an outflow port on the side of the hull, near the waterline. Miller kicked the latch, and it swung open. They tumbled out into the dry dock water, gasping for air. Chaos reigned. The ship was smoking, flames licking from the upper deck. Sirens were wailing everywhere. The private security forces were pulling back, more concerned with the exploding battery ordnance than the intruders. Miller commanded. They swam toward the bayou opening, using the smoke as cover. They reached the skiff where Gator was waiting, his engine already idling. Gator yelled, hauling them aboard. As they sped away into the fog, a massive explosion rocked the shipyard. A fireball rose into the night sky, illuminating the silhouette of the broken black ship. Sarah lay on the bottom of the boat, shivering, covered in oil and muck. She looked at Miller. He was bleeding from a graze on his cheek, but he was smiling. A real smile. Miller said. Sarah reached into her wet pocket. The paper was gone, dissolved in the water. But it didn't matter. The audit was complete. She looked back at the burning shipyard. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had crushed the rat. She said, her voice trembling. Miller laughed, wiping the blood from his face. As the skiff disappeared into the swamp, Sarah looked at her hands. They were shaking, but they were steady enough. She had balanced the books. 3 days later, Sarah sat in a small cafe in New Orleans. The news on the television above the counter was blaring. Sarah sipped her coffee. It was black, bitter, and hot. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Review complete. File closed. M. She smiled. She deleted the message. She opened her laptop. A new email notification popped up. It was from the central office. Subject: Discrepancy in file 77B. Urgent. Sarah stared at the screen for a long moment. Then, she slowly closed the laptop. Quote 404, she whispered to the empty room. Quote 405. She stood up, left a generous tip, and walked out into the sunlight. The ghosts were gone, the books were closed, and for the first time in years, the ledger of her life felt perfectly, beautifully balanced. The red alert on the monitor did not blink. It simply burned, a solid, unyielding crimson box in the center of the spreadsheet. Sarah Jenkins stared at the pixelated notification. She was not in the cafe in New Orleans anymore. She was in a temporary workspace in Atlanta, a sterile glass cube provided by the firm, the air conditioning humming with a specific, headache-inducing frequency. The vacation had lasted exactly 45 minutes. The itch to close the ledger, to resolve the discrepancy of file 77B, had been stronger than the allure of sunlight and bitter coffee. She clicked the box. The screen refreshed, pulling data from the newly integrated index system. Source: Ohio Bureau of Workers' Compensation. Date of incident: February 14, 2007. Claimant: A.S. Miller, alias flagged. Biometric cross-ref: Fingerprint Index 44A, partial. Sarah picked up the phone. She didn't dial the central office. She dialed a number she had memorized 3 days ago in a swamp. 406, the voice rasped on the other end. He sounded like he was sleeping or drinking or both. 407, Sarah said. Her voice was flat, devoid of triumph. It was just business. 408. 409. There was a long silence on the line, followed by the sound of a chair scraping against a wooden floor. 411. Sarah said, typing a command to print the file. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life. 412. Sarah said, "You sell 'em there." Sarah find it. She said, the laser printer in the corner whirred to life. Miller said, the line clicked dead. Detective Miller arrived 6 hours later. He looked out of place in the corporate glass box of the auditing firm. He wore a rumpled jacket that smelled of stale tobacco and rain, carrying a cardboard box that looked like it had survived a flood. He dropped the box onto Sarah's pristine glass desk. Dust motes danced in the fluorescent light. Miller said, pointing a calloused finger at the box. Sarah looked at the box. It was labelled in thick black marker. Sterling, A. Port Authority, 1992. Miller said. Sarah removed the lid. Inside were manila folders, yellowed at the edges, bound with brittle rubber bands. Photographs of a foggy dock. Xerox copies of cargo manifests. Sarah said. Miller frowned. He dug through the stack and pulled out a thin file. Sarah said, not looking up from her screen. Miller put on a pair of cheap reading glasses. He squinted at the faded, typewritten report. 420, 421. Miller shuffled papers. He found the document. 422. Sarah turned her monitor so Miller could see it. On the screen was a high-resolution scan of a medical intake form from a Dayton urgent care clinic, dated 2 weeks prior. The image showed a man's arm being prepped for a tetanus shot. The tattoo was faded, stretched by age and weight gain, but it was undeniable. A nautical star. The John Doe in the river wasn't Sterling, Sarah said. It was a false lead that let everyone stop looking. The insurance companies paid out because it was cheaper than keeping the file open. But the biometrics don't lie. This man in Ohio injured his hand on a press line. The employer required a background check for the workers' comp claim. They took prints. Miller stared at the screen. He looked like a man watching a fundamental law of physics break in front of him. He was on the ship, Sarah. The Mary Celeste of the modern age. The Triton's Pride. He signed in at the gate. The ship left. He wasn't on it when it docked in Hamburg. He wasn't in the water. He didn't come out the gate. He didn't come out the gate? Sarah repeated. Are you sure? We had the logs. 2 guards at the main exit. Every vehicle checked. Every pedestrian logged. Paper logs, Sarah said. Yeah, paper. The kind you can't hack. The kind you can misread, Sarah corrected. I need to see the exit logs from the night of November 12th, 1992. Do you have them? Miller reached to the bottom of the box. He pulled out a heavy, bound ledger. The cover was grey canvas, stained with coffee rings. Port of Savannah, Gate 4, 1900 hours to 0700 hours. Sarah took the book. It was heavy, smelling of mildew. She opened it. The handwriting was archaic, a mix of cursive and block letters scrawled by tired men working the graveyard shift. She ran her finger down the column. 2215, truck 404, driver P. Kowalski, empty. 2240, maintenance van, driver T. Higgins, cleared. 235, private transport, driver L. Davis, passenger A. Starling. Sarah stopped. Her finger hovered over the line. Miller, she said softly. What? Look at the entry for 2305. Miller leaned in. A. Starling, passenger in a private transport, probably a crew shuttle or a taxi. Arthur Sterling, Sarah said. Arthur Starling. Miller scoffed. It's a typo, Sarah, a phonetic mistake. The guard heard Sterling and wrote Starling. It happens. Exactly, Sarah said. Her eyes narrowed. It happens. And because it happens, the search algorithm you used in 1992 didn't catch it. You were looking for Sterling with an E. The physical search of the logs was done by human eyes, looking for a specific shape of a word. When they saw Starling Their brains filtered it out. A bird. A common name, not the missing man. "So he rode out?" Miller asked, skepticism heavy in his voice. "Just rode out the front gate? The manifest for that transport would have been checked." "That's the second step," Sarah said. She turned back to her computer. The Savannah Port Authority digitized their archives in 2006. It was a massive project, millions of documents scanned. If that private transport company submitted a bill of lading or a passenger manifest, it's in the database. She began to type. The keystrokes were rapid, aggressive. She queried the date. She queried the driver's name. L. Davis's. The database churned, a spinning hourglass displayed on the screen. Miller said, staring at the ledger, 449. Sarah recited from memory, 450. The computer pinged. A document appeared. It was a scanned image of a carbon copy receipt from Coastal Cab and Courier. Date, November 12, 1992. Pickup, Port Gate 4. Drop-off, Greyhound Bus Terminal, downtown Savannah. Passenger, A. Starling. Payment, cash. Miller whispered. Sarah sat back. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the cold, hard satisfaction of the audit. Miller looked at the map on the wall. He muttered. Sarah said. Miller picked up the ledger. He closed it with a heavy thud. He said. The drive north was long and quiet. They took Sarah's rental car, a silver sedan that smelled of lemon air freshener. They crossed the state lines, watching the landscape shift from the humid pines of Georgia to the rolling hills of Kentucky, and finally, the flat industrial grey of Ohio. They didn't talk much. There was nothing left to theorize. They had the records. They had the math. Now they just needed the man. They arrived in Dayton just as the shift was changing at the Miami Valley Logistics Hub. It was a massive corrugated metal box of a building, surrounded by a sea of asphalt and semi-trucks. The sky was overcast, a low ceiling of slate clouds. Sarah pulled into the visitor lot. "What's the play?" she asked. "You're the cop." "I'm not a cop here," Miller said. "I'm just a guy with a closed case file. We go in, we ask for the claimant, we see if he runs." "He won't run," Sarah said. "He's tired. You can see it in the medical claim. High blood pressure, arthritis. He's been carrying a dead man's name for 15 years. That's heavy." They walked to the main office. The receptionist was behind a glass partition, looking bored. "We're here from the insurance adjusters," Sarah said, flashing her badge, "regarding the claim for Mr. Arthur Miller, the hand injury." The receptionist didn't even look up. They walked through the door. The break room was small, smelling of burnt popcorn and floor wax. Vending machines hummed against the wall. Sitting at a round laminate table was a man. He was older than the photos in the file. His hair was gone, replaced by a shiny, liver-spotted scalp. He had gained weight, the heavy, solid weight of a man who eats cheap food and lifts heavy boxes. His left hand was wrapped in a thick white bandage. He was writing on a clipboard with his right hand. He stopped when the door opened. He looked up. His eyes were the same, pale blue, watchful. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked at Miller. Miller stood by the door, his hands in his pockets. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't shout. He just watched. The man at the table slowly put the pen down. He let out a breath, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to deflate his entire posture. Miller said. The man didn't correct him. He didn't say his name was Miller. He didn't ask who they were. He looked at the bandage on his hand, then back at the detective. "I knew the thumb would do it," Arthur Sterling said. His voice was gravelly, shaped by years of silence. "Soon as they put my hand on that scanner for the background check, I knew." "You had a good run," Miller said. He pulled a chair out and sat opposite him. Sarah remained standing, holding the file against her chest. 15 years, Sterling said. Is my wife okay?" "She's in France," Sarah said. "She remarried, an architect." Sterling nodded slowly. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "Good. She deserved that. She deserved better than a debt-ridden sailor." "You cost the insurance company $2 million, Sarah said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact," Sterling said, gesturing to the warehouse around them. Sarah reminded him. Sterling looked at his bandaged hand. Miller said. Sterling admitted. Miller muttered. Sterling corrected. Sarah placed the folder on the table. Sterling looked at the file. He looked tired, infinite, and deep. He held up his bandaged hand. Miller reached into his jacket pocket. For a second, Sterling flinched, expecting handcuffs. Miller pulled out a pack of gum. He slid a piece across the table. Miller said. Sterling took the gum. He unwrapped it with his good hand. Sarah watched them, the detective and the ghost. There was no animosity, just the quiet resolution of an equation that had been unbalanced for too long. She opened her laptop bag and took out a digital recorder. Sarah said, her voice shifting into her professional cadence. Sterling said. The man looked at the fluorescent lights buzzing above him. He looked at the exit sign glowing red in the corner. Then he looked Sarah in the eye. He said clearly. Sarah watched the audio waveform spike on her screen, capturing the voice print. The lines stabilized. The red alert in her mind finally turned green. She typed a final entry into the database. Status: resolved. Location: verified. Subject: located. She closed the laptop. The case of the maritime ghost was over. It hadn't ended with a gunshot or a chase, but with a misspelled name in a dusty ledger and a crushed finger in Ohio. The books were balanced, but the ledger of human experience refused to close so neatly. The silence that followed Sarah's mental confirmation was heavy, pressing against the acoustic tiles of the break room ceiling. It was the sound of a life being dismantled, brick by brick, moment by moment. Miller stood up, his knees cracking audibly, a sound like dry twigs snapping in a winter wood. He walked to the window, peering through the grime-streaked glass at the parking lot below, where the grey Ohio slush was slowly consuming the asphalt. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just giving Sterling a moment to breathe the last few breaths of a free man, even if that freedom had been a cage of his own making. Miller said, his back to the room. He checked his watch, a battered analog piece that had seen more stakeouts than family dinners. Sterling nodded, a small, jerky motion. He was staring at the wrapper of the gum Miller had given him, smoothing the silver foil against the Formica table with his uninjured thumb. He seemed fascinated by the way the light caught the creases, transforming the trash into a topographical map of a metallic world. Sterling said softly. Sarah looked her bag. She hadn't packed the recorder away yet. She simply held it, feeling its weight. Is there evidence in it? The money? Sterling let out a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a cough. The money? No. The money is... Well, that's a long story for the ride, isn't it? No. In the locker. I have a thermos. And a book. Lonesome Dove. I'm halfway through. I hate leaving things unfinished. We can get the book, Arthur, Sarah said, using his real name. It felt strange on her tongue, heavy with the gravity of the resurrection she had just performed. We'll make sure it goes with you to Holding. Art, he corrected instinctively, then stopped. He looked at his bandaged hand, the blood having seeped through the gauze to create a rust-coloured bloom. I guess not any more. Art Miller clocked out for the last time. Sarah watched him, her mind involuntarily calculating the variables of his existence. For 5 years, this man had been a variable with a value of 0 in the system. Now, he was a massive liability, a complex integer of fraud, restitution, and legal fees. But looking at him, slumped shoulders, grey stubble, the smell of industrial lubricant and old sweat clinging to his flannel shirt, she couldn't help but see the profound exhaustion of the performance. Sarah asked, gesturing to the hand. Sterling shrugged. He exhaled, a long, shuddering release. Miller turned back from the window. The door to the break room creaked open, and the foreman, a burly man named Kowalski, who smelled of stale tobacco and ozone, poked his head in. He looked from Miller to Sarah, then rested his gaze on Sterling. Confusion clouded his face, thick and genuine. Sterling looked up at Kowalski. For a second, the mask of Art Miller slipped back on, the genial, quiet worker who kept his head down and did his job. Kowalski stepped fully into the room, his eyes narrowing at the badge clipping Miller's belt, which was now visible as the detective's jacket fell open. "5," Miller said, his voice dropping into that authoritative baritone that brooked no argument. As Kowalski bristled, protective of his crew. Sterling said, standing up slowly. The chair scraped against the linoleum, a harsh screech that made everyone wince. Kowalski blinked. Sterling said, and his voice cracked, a fissure revealing the despair beneath. Kowalski looked at the three of them, sensing the invisible walls of a tragedy he didn't understand. He nodded slowly, backing out. "All right, Art, whatever you say. Take care of yourself." The door clicked shut, severing Sterling's connection to the present. He was now wholly owned by the past. "That was kind of you," Sarah said. "Jim's a good man," Sterling murmured. "He invited me to Thanksgiving 2 years in a row. I always said I had family in Cleveland. I sat in my apartment and ate a frozen turkey dinner and watched Static on the TV because I was afraid the news might show my face." "The 2 million, Miller said, steering the conversation back to the mechanics of the crime as he pulled a chair out and sat opposite Sterling. He wasn't interrogating, not really. The confession was done. He was just curious. At the mention of her name, Sterling flinched more violently than he had when his hand was crushed. He closed his eyes, and a tear leaked out, cutting a clean track through the grime on his cheek. 536, he whispered. Sarah hesitated. The data was clear. The beneficiary status, the payout dates, the surveillance logs. Sarah opened the laptop again, not to record, but to check. She tapped a few keys. Sterling nodded, a look of grim satisfaction settling on his face. Sarah frowned, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. The silence that followed was absolute. It sucked the air out of the room. Sterling stared at Sarah, his mouth slightly open. The colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like the corpse he had pretended to be. Sarah said gently. Sterling's voice rose, panic edging in. Miller leaned forward. Sterling froze. His eyes darted back and forth, searching his memory, replaying the frantic, sweat-soaked hours before he drove his car off the pier. Miller sighed, running a hand over his face. Sarah finished the thought. Sterling argued weakly. Miller said first, from the first least for Miller said him. 559. Sterling whispered, the realization crushing him. Blue and red lights flashed against the ceiling, sweeping across the acoustic tiles in a rhythmic, nauseating strobe. The local police had arrived. The sanctuary of the break room was breached. Miller said, standing up. He didn't pull out the handcuffs immediately. He waited for Sterling to stand on his own. Sterling rose, his movements stiff and geriatric. He looked small in his work clothes, a man diminished by the sheer weight of his errors. He held out his good hand, and then the bad one. "Front," Miller said softly. "I'll cuff you in the front. Mind the finger." The metal clicked, a sound of finality that echoed louder than the buzzing lights. They walked him out through the factory floor. The shift had changed, or maybe the word had spread, because the hum of machinery had dulled. Workers in hard hats and safety goggles stopped what they were doing to watch. They stood by the conveyor belts and the stamping presses, wiping grease from their hands with rags, watching Art Miller, the quiet guy who always brought donuts on Fridays, being led away in irons. There was no judgment in their eyes, only a dull curiosity and the unspoken relief that it wasn't them. In this economy, in this town, everyone was running from something: debt, alimony, addiction. Art had just been caught. Sterling kept his head down, staring at the concrete floor, counting the cracks. He couldn't bear to meet their eyes. He couldn't bear to see the reflection of his own failure. Outside, the Ohio winter was living up to its reputation. A mix of rain and sleet fell in sheets, stinging the skin. The police cruisers were idling, exhaust pluming white into the grey afternoon. 2 uniformed officers stepped forward, looking young and sharp-edged compared to Miller's rumpled weariness. One of the officers asked, eyeing Sterling. Miller said, handing over a sheaf of paperwork Sarah had printed from her portable printer. The officer took Sterling by the arm. It wasn't rough, but it was firm. the grip of the state claiming its property. Sarah watched as they guided him into the back of the cruiser. Sterling ducked his head to avoid the doorframe. As the door slammed shut, he looked out the window. His eyes met Sarah's. There was no plea for mercy, no anger, just a profound, bottomless confusion. He mouthed one word: Elise. Then the car pulled away, tires crunching on the gravel, disappearing into the veil of rain. Sarah shivered, pulling her trench coat tighter. The cold seemed to seep through the wool, settling in her marrow. "You okay?" Miller asked, lighting a cigarette and shielding the flame with his hand. "The numbers balanced," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "I found him. The company recovers the payout. The fraud is exposed. My job is done." But the equation is wrong," she said. "The wife, she never spent the money. The blackmailers never hurt her. He destroyed his life to solve a problem that maybe solved itself, or never existed." Miller took a long drag, blowing the smoke out to mingle with the sleet. "Fear makes people do stupid math, Sarah. He didn't run because of the money. He ran because he was scared, and fear doesn't follow actuarial tables." "We have to go to the station," Sarah said, turning toward their rental car. "I need to file the recovery report, and I need to call the legal department, see if they'll seek maximum sentencing." "They will," Miller said. "It's $2 million. They'll want a pound of flesh." "He doesn't have any flesh left," Sarah snapped, surprising herself with the anger in her voice. "Look at him, Miller. He's a ghost. You can't incarcerate a ghost." "Watch them try," Miller muttered. They got into the car, the interior smelling of stale coffee and rental car cleaner. Miller started the engine, and the wipers began their hypnotic rhythm. Thwack, hiss, clearing the view only for it to be obscured again a second later. The drive to the precinct was a blur of grey strip malls and skeletal trees. Sarah opened her laptop, the screen glowing blue in the dim cabin. She pulled up the file on Elise Sterling. Subject: Sterling, Elise. Age: 48. Occupation: waitress. Assets: residential property, encumbered. Savings trust, frozen. She stared at the photo attached to the file. It was an old DMV photo, a woman with tired eyes and a mouth set in a line of grim determination. She looked like a woman who could hold a secret for 5 years, or a grief. "Miller," Sarah said, not looking up. "When we get back to Mobile, I want to talk to her." "The wife?" Miller glanced over. "That's not protocol. Legal handles the notification." "I know, but I need to know why. Why didn't she spend the money? Why didn't she leave? If she knew he was alive, why did she stay in that house waiting for the sharks?" "Maybe she was waiting for him," Miller suggested. "Or maybe she was the shark," Sarah whispered, a new variable entering her mind. Miller braked as a traffic light turned red. He looked at her. "What? Think about it. He leaves, she gets the money. She doesn't spend it, so she can't be accused of fraud if he's found. She keeps the house. She plays the grieving widow. If he never comes back, she eventually spends it when the statute of limitations on the investigation cools down. If he does come back, well, he takes the fall." "That's cold," Miller said. "That's colder than this weather." "It's actuarial," Sarah said. "It's risk management." They arrived at the precinct, a brick fortress that looked like it had been built to withstand a siege. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of floor wax. They found Sterling in the booking area. He was sitting on a metal bench, his shoelaces removed, his belt gone. A nurse was tending to his hand, wrapping it in fresh, stark white gauze. He looked up as they approached. The booking officer, a heavy-set man with a moustache that looked like a push broom, was typing on a computer. "Processing is slow," the officer grunted. "System's lagging. We're waiting on the feds to confirm the identity flags." Sarah approached the bench. Sterling didn't stand. He looked like he might never stand again. "Quote 597, she said. "Quote 598, he asked. "Quote 599, he nodded. "Quote 600, 601, Sarah said, lowering her voice so the officer wouldn't hear. "Elise." There were calls. From her house. To a number in frantic succession the night you disappeared. Sterling stiffened.
Calls to who? To the police, Sarah lied. She watched his pupils.
They didn't dilate with fear. They remained static. He was confused. Sarah said, taking a gamble. Sterling looked around the room, paranoia flickering back to life. Miller interrupted. Sterling said miserably. Sarah looked at Miller. The numbers didn't add up. If the debt was $500,000 and the policy was $2 million, the Valos would have taken their cut and left Elise alone. Why didn't she pay them? Unless the debt didn't exist. Arthur, Sarah said slowly, did you ever meet the Valo brothers in person? No, Sterling admitted. I dealt with their fixer, a guy named Ray. Ray, Miller repeated. Last name? Just Ray, big guy, scar on his neck. Miller pulled out his phone. He tapped into the law enforcement database app. Mobile PD records. Let's search for associates. Ray, he scrolled. Raymond Hatcher? Enforcer for the local syndicate. Deceased, 3 years ago. Dead? Sterling blinked. Then the debt is gone? Hatcher was a freelancer, Miller said, reading the file. He didn't work for the Valos. The Valos are a myth, Sterling. A bogeyman story used to scare tourists and small business owners. There is no Valo crime family in Mobile. There hasn't been since the 80s. The room seemed to tilt. Sterling gripped the edge of the metal bench with his good hand. What? No, Ray said. Ray was scamming you, Miller said brutally. He was bleeding you dry on a loan you probably paid off 10 times over. And when you couldn't pay, he scared you into running so he could claim… What? Did you sign anything over to him? The boat, Sterling whispered. I signed the title of the Jenny 2 over to him the day before I left, as collateral. Sarah closed her eyes. It was so tragically simple. A con man, a scared Mark, and a fake death. And Elise? Sarah asked. Did she know Ray? Sterling shook his head. No, she hated him. She saw him come to the house once. She screamed at him to get off the porch. So, Sarah summarized, you ran away from a ghost story. You left your wife with $2 million she was too afraid or too honest to touch. And you've been living in Ohio as Art Miller, making $17 an hour, while a dead man's lie kept you in exile. Sterling looked at his hands. He looked at the fresh white bandage. He began to weep. Not the silent, stoic tears of earlier, but ugly, heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. It was the sound of a man realizing that his tragedy was actually a farce. The booking officer looked up, annoyed. Hey, keep it down over there. Miller put a hand on Sterling's shoulder. It was a gesture of pity, but also of grounding. It's over now, Arthur. The lie is done. I want to go home, Sterling sobbed. I just want to go home. You are, Sarah said, but not to the home you remember. The extradition paperwork took 36 hours. Sarah spent the time in a Motel 6 off the highway, building the case file. She drafted the narrative for the insurance board. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting and narrative reporting. She detailed the fraud, the flight, the capture. But in the mitigating factors section, she found herself writing more than usual. Subject acted under duress, albeit duress based on fraudulent information provided by a third party, deceased. Subject has no prior criminal history. Subject has lived a law-abiding life under the alias. She knew the board wouldn't care. Fraud is fraud. But she had to write it. Miller spent the time coordinating with Mobile PD. He arranged for a transport van. He didn't trust the airlines with a prisoner in this condition, and frankly, he wanted to drive. He wanted to see Sterling through to the end. When they picked Sterling up from the county jail, he looked different. Shaved, showered, dressed in a clean orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. The Art Miller disguise was gone, washed away down the shower drain. Arthur Sterling was back, but he looked more fragile than ever. They shackled his ankles and his good wrist to a waist chain. Sarah watched, feeling a pang of guilt. It was necessary, but it felt cruel. Long drive, Miller said as they loaded him into the back of the secure van. We'll stop for food. No fast food. I know a place in Nashville. Thank you, Sterling said. His voice was flat, devoid of affect. He had cried himself empty. The journey south was a transition through seasons. They left the grey sleet of Ohio, past through the rolling brown hills of Kentucky and into the vibrant green humidity of the deep South. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, Miller drove, and Sterling sat in the cage behind them. They talked little. What was there to say? Somewhere outside of Birmingham, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Sterling spoke. "What happens to the money?" he asked. Sarah turned in her seat. "The insurance money? The company reclaims it. Since Elise never spent it, it's a simple reversal. The trust is dissolved." "So she loses everything," Sterling said. "The house. Without the money, she can't keep it." "She's been keeping it for 5 years on a waitress's salary," Sarah reminded him. "She's resilient, Arthur." "She deserves better," he murmured. "She deserved a husband who wasn't a coward." "She deserved the truth," Sarah said. They hit the Mobile city limits at 2 a.m. The air was thick and salty, smelling of the bay and jasmine. It was the smell of Sterling's past. He pressed his face against the wire mesh of the divider, watching the familiar streets roll by. "Take me to the house," he said suddenly. "Please, before the station, just drive by." "We can't do that, Arthur," Miller said. "Direct transport. Rules." "Please," Sterling begged. "I just want to see if the light is on. She always left the porch light on, for when I came back from the charters." Miller looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the GPS. The route to the precinct could technically go past Bayview. It was a detour, but a minor one. "Technically," Sarah said, "we need to verify the asset location for the recovery report." Miller smiled, a small, tired curving of his lips. "Right, asset verification." He turned the wheel, steering the van away from the downtown precinct and toward the residential district near the bay. The streets became narrower, lined with ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. They turned onto Bayview. The houses were old, weathered bungalows raised on stilts against the hurricane tides. "That one," Sterling whispered. "The blue one, number 405. Miller slowed the van to a crawl. The house was dark. The windows were black eyes staring out at the street. The yard was overgrown, the grass knee-high. A for sale sign stood crookedly in the front yard, looking like it had been there for a long time, and the porch light was off. "She's gone," Sterling said, his voice breaking. "She sold it." Sarah squinted at the sign. "No, look at the sticker. Foreclosure. Bank owned." "She lost it," Sarah said softly. "She didn't use the money. She let the bank take it rather than touch the fraud money." Sterling stared at the dark house. The tragedy was complete. His sacrifice had saved nothing. His wife had lost her home because of his crime, and she had refused to be saved by his sin. "Where is she?" Sterling asked. "I don't know," Sarah said. "We'll find out. But Arthur, she has integrity, more than you gave her credit for." Miller accelerated, pulling away from the house of ghosts. "We have to go in, Arthur." Sterling slumped back against the metal seat. "I know. I'm ready." They arrived at the precinct. The booking process here was different. It was familiar territory for the cops, and Sterling was a local legend, the man who came back from the dead. Officers whispered as he was led through the halls. Sarah and Miller sat in the captain's office, drinking terrible coffee while the final paperwork was stamped. "Quote 680, the captain said. "Quote 681. 682, Sarah asked. 683. 684. The captain frowned. 685. Sterling, sitting in the corner, handcuffed to a chair, let out a small, hysterical giggle. 686, he said. 687. 688, Miller asked. 689, the captain said. 690. Sarah stood up. 691. 692, Miller warned. 693. 694, Sarah said. 695. She walked out of the office, leaving Miller with the ghost. The bakery on Dauphin Street was closed, but a light burned in the upstairs window. Sarah stood on the sidewalk, looking up. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her bag, the weight of the files, the weight of the truth. She wasn't just an actuary anymore. She was the messenger of consequences. She walked to the side door and pressed the buzzer. A minute later, a voice came through the intercom, tired, wary. "Who is it?" "Mrs. Sterling?" Sarah asked. "My name is Sarah. I'm an investigator." There was a long pause. "Did you find him?" "Yes," Sarah said. "He's alive." The buzzer buzzed, unlocking the door. Sarah pushed it open and stepped into the stairwell. It smelled of yeast and sugar, the smell of rising, of new beginnings. She climbed the stairs, ready to explain the unexplainable, ready to balance the final equation. Arthur Sterling was in a cell. The money was returning to the corporation. The house was gone. But as Sarah reached the top of the stairs and saw the woman standing in the doorway, grey-haired, worn, but eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and relief, she knew that the story wasn't about the math. It was about the endurance of the things that cannot be calculated. "Where is he?" Elise asked.
"He's in custody," Sarah said. "He's safe." Elise let out a breath she had been holding for 5 years. She leaned against the doorframe, her hands trembling. Is he hurt?" "He hurt his hand," Sarah said, "and his heart. But he's Arthur. He's exactly who you think he is."